The rocks of my family were two incredible women. This was my one grandmother who lived to be 101 years old and never went more than 6 feet from this actual stove. She was the original Olive Garden. She could make an eggplant parmesan in less than 15 minutes. She had a stash of frozen ingredients in the refrigerator that never seemed to be depleted, and she was an absolute amazing cook. My other grandmother, that's her on the left, lived much closer to me and actually taught me, besides speaking Italian, really the joy of cooking and the sort of wonderful presentation and the production of things like gnocchi and polenta and risotto ai funghi and pollo in umido and all kinds of fantastic recipes that I actually still make today. But both of them taught me the amazing power of food that it had to bring people together and sort of unite them in a sort of beautiful, wonderful way. I have a company called Memo Productions, which is a relatively small office. At any given point, it's myself and 3 or 4 designers and support people. The bulk of our work is actually image and branding development. We help our clients create and tell stories about products that they make or services that they sell. We do the basic graphic design projects, logos, collateral materials, websites, packaging, and even some restaurant interior design consultation, you name it. We also do a fair amount of books and cookbooks, and a lot of the cookbooks that we do are for a chef that's called Mario Batali, that you've probably heard of. And that's going to be the focus of my talk tonight. Now, I don't consider myself the expert in the field, say like the way Louise Feely is the expert of fancy food packaging, or 2x4 is the experts in esoteric cultural work, we just happen to have done a lot of cookbooks. And the notable thing I think about the work that we do as cookbooks is we've done all of Mario's cookbooks, which I think are 8, maybe 9 at this point, depending on how you count them. And we also do a lot of other things for Mario Batali. So the cookbook work is cookbook work, but it also takes place in a larger story of his brand persona. And so the work that we do really informs the rest of the work for the restaurants, for his foundation, and those things also inform the work that we do for the cookbooks. And whenever I tell people that we do cookbooks, like Melissa just the other day said to me, "Oh my God, I would love to do a cookbook." And it just seems like the dream client for so many graphic designers. And it always makes me think like, well, what is it about cookbooks that makes people get all warm and fuzzy inside? And I do agree that on the plus side, you do typically get to create something really sort of beautiful, inherently beautiful, and a lot of times from like soup to nuts. I'm going to throw in so many of these hideous food puns that you're going to hate it by the end of the talk. Anyway, beautiful food photography, wonderful styling, hopefully insightful prose, and fantastic recipes that come together to make something that's inherently kind of wonderful. And you also get to make something that I think people use. Like I always wanted to do the biennial catalog, but most people buy it and it sits on the shelf, I think, until like once a year. Cookbooks, I think people really actually use. They get dirty. You hand them down to people, and I really like that what we make becomes part of like people's lives. On the downside, now the list gets really huge. They're not the most lucrative clients or projects that we do in the studio. In fact, it's the one project type that we do that the client calls up and says, "We got $8,000. They're not like, "Could you tell us how much it might cost?" They're like, "No, it's $8,000. And so there's this horrible pause, and then you kind of figure out, well, what can I do for that amount of money? But it is a very funny sort of thing that it is that one last vestige of projects where there's no negotiation somehow in the price. They somehow take forever. We shoot photos like on July 4th, and then like next August, the book comes out. And it's like not a lot really happens, but it just seems to take absolutely forever. And then, of course, there's juggling a whole bunch of different egos, the chef, the publisher, mine, God forbid, the copy editor, the marketing people, and then like Barnes & Noble weighs in because they won't actually buy the cover unless it has like red on it for some reason. So, but before I get too long into the cookbooks, I'd just like to take a momentary diversion and give you a brief look at sort of where I came from and what my story is. And I'm going to go fast through this appetizer section so that we can get to the entree. So don't worry that there's a really big like Chateaubriand coming if I rush through this whole thing. I started, when I came back from Italy, oh wait, I totally missed the whole history. I graduated from RISD and went to a company called AGP, which is a very large corporate identity firm, which at the time was among the most hideously boring jobs I could have ever had in my whole entire life. They did really huge corporate identity projects, and actually, in retrospect, I learned so much more than I ever thought I did. But while I was there, it was hell on earth. And then my mother called me one day and said, you should quit and move to Italy for 3 weeks with your grandmother who desperately wants to go. So of course I was like, when your mother calls you and tells you to quit, you should definitely quit. So I went to Italy and came home and was doing sort of nothing, and I got a call one day from this guy named Tibor Kalman who said, hi, I'm Tibor Kalman and I have a company called M & Company and I need someone, would you like to come in for an interview? And I got a job very easily at M & Company, which was a sort of seminal, mind-bending, fantastic experience. I left there and worked for Malcolm Forbes for a while doing a magazine called Egg. And then, again, in a very serendipitous way, got a job working for Benetton in Italy. And I moved, like a freaky thing, I moved to the town that my grandmother left to come here. So I have first cousins that lived there. I used to see my cousins like at lunch every day at the Benetton commissary, and it was a thing that I like absolutely couldn't not avoid. So I worked there for a year and a half, and then worked for Ettore Sottsass in Milan, who's a design legend, and moved back in the early 90s and realized I needed to start my own firm. So when I was leaving, Tibor actually was on the next plane out to Italy, because he had started Colors. So Restaurant Florent needed an art director. And I started to do all of that work for Restaurant Florent, which the identity had been done, but we did all of their menus, and they've changed tons of times over the years. We used to do fantastic posters like this design. You know, I think it's in the Cooper Hewitt, but I'm not sure. It's like we do like 10 of them with like Xeroxes. But for the Bastille Day festivals that we used to do. My personal favorite, these two Oscar posters, which I loved. And then this Oscar poster for the night that, that Brokeback Mountain won the Oscars. And you might not remember, but Morgan Freeman specifically mentioned gay penguins. And I can just imagine them making that trek, kicking themselves because they didn't go to Key West like all their other friends. They were trekking across the tundra. But nonetheless, they were gay penguins. And then, unfortunately, the whole 15 years I worked at Restaurant Florent, I always noticed if you take the L out of Florent, it says for rent. So unfortunately, when they closed, we actually got the opportunity to use the for rent sign in the thing, which absolutely broke my heart. This is a client who I have worked with for many years in different guises. They owned Hale and Hearty Soups for quite some time, and they opened Schnippers about a year and a little bit ago. And they're that type of client that doesn't make a single decision without calling me, which I sort of love. They knew that they kind of, because they were in this amazing Renzo Piano building, didn't really need an architect per se, but they knew they needed a branding person, and luckily they called me to do all of the signage. The biggest, I think, menu board in New York City. You can see it from like 30,000 feet. And some in-store graphics using this fantastic sort of, Kentucky Fried Chicken roadside signage throughout the restaurant. And then little sort of stuff like this. Quality actually is their middle name. It's Schnipper's Quality Kitchen. So we were able to do this, thing for the back of the T-shirts. And then oftentimes we get picked up to do some advertising. We didn't do the logo for this. This was done by some place called like Mocha Design or like Nuka, I think, did the identity for this place. But they called us a few years later and said, we love your Florent stuff. We need to do some quirky advertising. So we used to just churn out ads for no apparent, theme. This was a post-Thanksgiving theme, actually. And my favorite part about these ads was the fantastic juxtaposition between this and the non-designed ads. Now, there was another restaurant in town that used to always do a plate with a fuzzy rose and a violin in the background. And I always used to love to see our ads next to those things. Or this fantastic Photoshop nightmare for a magazine called Weird New Jersey. And then we actually got, we met Mario Batali because another old friend of mine from Memo Company is related to him and is his creative director. And she introduced me to Mario, and ever since, we had done a cookbook for him a while ago, and then ever since Del Pozo opened, which I can't even remember when that was, we started to doing all of the restaurants' logos and the collateral materials for all of his restaurants. And we've recently got involved with his foundation and with the, sort of unifying the whole entire restaurant group. These are some of the collateral pieces that we've done for those. These are both in Vegas. This is the entrance to a mega steakhouse in Venice. I mean, in the Venetian Hotel. On the other side of this are about 50,000 slot machines. So it's like, there's this oasis of calm and then like a gajillion slot machines on the other side. Or this crazily oversized menu that actually they're like the only restaurant in the country that still sends this out to a printer and gets it printed. No letter pressing, no Xeroxing on 8.5 by 11. They actually print these things. Or this series of placemats that we did for the absolutely amazing Mozza Pizzeria in Los Angeles. They use them at the bar. We replace them every so often, and I actually sort of love them. Mario in 1998, I think, was when we did this, was a relatively unknown chef. His Po restaurant was wildly successful. I think he had just started doing Food Network stuff, and he got an offer to do a cookbook with Clarkson Potter. And he asked Lisa to help with the cookbook, and Lisa in turn called me, Lisa, my old friend and his creative director. And we put together a cookbook, which was actually the first book I had really ever done besides cookbook. The layout is absolutely simple by today's standards. We were trying to tell a story of old, new. He had two villages in his life. One was his village, because he spent a lot of time in Italy, in this tiny little village, and then his new village of Manhattan. The one thing that I remember being really obsessed with was, A, the recipes were actually really simple, and B, we really wanted to make it super obvious from the minute you opened the book what ingredients you needed. We didn't really care that you needed a cup of vin santo. We only just really cared that you needed vin santo, arborio, butter, shiitakes. You could look in your pantry and be like, bada bing, I can make it. Like, no big deal. So that was our inspiration for this, is really making the ingredients the absolute sort of focus of the book. My favorite moment of this book was we had to take some photos at Dean & DeLuca because we didn't have enough modern produce stuff. So me and Mark Ferry went to Dean & DeLuca one day, and this very cute Italian man was behind us, and he was like this close. And he was buttoned in, and then like every so often he'd say, "What are you doing?" And he'd say, "We're shooting." He's like, "For who?" Mario Batali. He's like, "You get permission?" And we're like, "Yeah." And then like he kept bothering us, and he was like, we were shooting a mostarda, which is not the most photogenic stuff in the world. And he said, "You really want to shoot that mostarda?" And I was like, "Oh boy, I almost said, would you get out of here?" And then a voice said, "Doug, don't do that." Because when he left, the photographer said, "I can't believe Giorgio De Luca still comes into the store," which would have been the absolute nightmare of the century. Then came the Barber Book, which was sort of Mario, I have arrived. The Barber was wildly successful. You couldn't get a reservation there if you sold like your children. Then it was the first book for Mario that actually had 4-color throughout, and the logo was done by my friend Lisa. And we sort of knew that we wanted to do a real homage to Italy, and most importantly, sort of Bodoni. And I had this book in my collection that I absolutely have always loved, a reprint of an old Domus publication. And it was the absolute inspiration for my book. There were illustrations by Joe Ponti, and all the type was just like restrained but crazy. You had these pages with like, that was the only page in the whole book with curve type like that. These sort of wonderful crossheads with all lowercase poster Bodoni, which made me super happy. These, again, sort of just like letter spacing things, like anything went. And I loved the sort of restraint of this book. or these sort of weird, this is a beautiful Joe Ponti illustration, and this kind of crazy typographic construction underneath. So that really became the inspiration for our Barber Book. A relatively simple, very restrained layout with really, really sort of bold little moments with the ingredients. And then we decided we were going to treat every single recipe head totally different, so no two are alike, which was a bitch and a half because invariably we spelled something wrong and we had to go back to the EPS file and then change it. But we did create a whole bunch of different recipe heads, and that was really the focus of our exploration here. You can see some of them just doing whatever we felt like. To make the book really sort of have a really strict grid, but these sort of wonderful little like moments of surprise. And then came this great book, which was our first book for David Boulay, our only book for David Boulay, and our first book for Dan Halpern at Echo. And this is my poster child for that project that he should have hired us way sooner than he did, because he actually went to Austria, wrote the book. He worked on this for like 10 years. He delivered the manuscript, and I was so excited because I knew that I wanted to do some crazy Vienna thing. We did a lot of research about, Joseph Hoffman, Coleman Moser, all kinds of Werkstatt stuff, and made the most beautiful prototype. Dan Halpern called and said, "Oh my God, it's the most beautiful prototype I've ever seen." And then David Boulay was like, "People don't want like that thing. They want simple. People are buying simple now." And I'm like, "David, does that look simple to you?" Like, the photos were shot on gold plates with star filters, with all the backgrounds were carved, Austrian people. It was like such a total disconnect. All the recipes started 4 days before you plan to serve, marinate the Brussels sprouts. And it was just like, there's nothing simple about your thing, and it really just broke my heart, and I couldn't fight with him. So we basically made a relatively restrained presentation of the recipes. That is not simple. It's not foam, for Christ's sakes. This I show with full trepidation, because you'll definitely think less of me for showing you this. But we always try to do high and low. And in the low department, you don't get much lower than the Pump Energy Food Cookbook. But you often don't also get to do a perfectly square cookbook, which I actually kind of loved. And we did a very sort of simple, structured layout. You can see those call-outs of strip steak or cremini mushrooms from like 100,000 feet. We probably should have worked with the author to get him to do these not. These meant something, like some are energy, some are walking. I don't remember the thing. It was a really bad idea. There was no talking to them. But I do sort of like the clunky boldness of this. I always sort of have. And then, along the same veins, this is a few notches up in the bottom of the barrel department. And when I was working at AGP, they always said, do not, under any circumstances, use a logo type in running copy. That was the one rule you should never break. And if you ever need to have evidence of that with your clients, I will email you this, because it shows you that NASCAR logo, it's never going to work in a headline. It's just the ugliest thing on earth. We also weren't totally responsible for this cover. That's a whole other story. But I do remember that this magazine came out more or less at the same time that we were doing that. And it isn't, even though in this slide thing it looks like they're the exact same size, but this is a little bit smaller than the NASCAR book, but not by a whole lot. And I do remember really being impressed with the economy of these pages and how they managed to fit into like a 4x6 page, what normally people fit into 8x10. There didn't seem to be a ton of wasted space, and it was clear and it was readable. And I really loved this, where it was the paragraph treatment of a recipe with ingredients called out. And I liked that it didn't divide the page in any way except for in horizontal banding, no sort of other grids across the page. So we tried to get them, and they actually did do this, to run all the ingredients together so that we didn't have to actually have that list that is always such a design element. We wanted to just do a very simple, and typically this was actually a relatively long, complicated recipe. And what I liked about this was that it really created a very sort of banding top to bottom, but no other sort of grid structure on the page. We had a fabulous time in Pocono Raceway shooting these things, driving around the racetrack, making meatloaf for 5 days. And especially like these pages where we actually were able to use some bold. That is actually better. I had to bump up the black on all these slides so that you could see stuff, so some of the blacker, that isn't a charred mess. It's actually a really beautiful rib. And then came the Mario Batali book, which again was like another major milestone for Mario. It was a mega book, 327 recipes. We sat down with Mario. We somehow managed to check which ones we actually thought should have been photographed and which ones we could shoot at family style, and just that was an ordeal in itself. But we, again, tried to do something that we were adamant about, and which was, I wanted to simplify the recipe, the ingredients somehow. And I remember going to Bonnie Slotin at Cookbooks and talking to her for a while and trying to find examples of something else besides just 4 cups onions sliced really thin, sauteed slightly. Like, I wanted to simplify that whole thing. And what I really found was like what I really wanted to do was this thing right here. What and how much? Like, wouldn't it be nice if we could just get the ingredients to the basic thing, what and how much? I fought like the Dickens, and because there were 327 recipes, it would have meant that Judith Sutton would have had to rewrite in a massive way the entire book. And I couldn't sell them, which really still pisses me off. But nonetheless, we came up with this relatively straightforward layout. We never really do a systematic color thing. It's more like whatever comes along we do. So this book was actually, besides being chunky, had some really beautiful unexpected color moments. And again, if anyone thinks, there's a lot of magazine people here that do photo shoots all the time, but we shot like 280 photos in, I think, like 8 days. You do the math. It was on the 4th floor of the Babbo townhouse, and this is how it went. We'd have a list. Mario would call up, how we doing on the tortellini? I got 4 minutes on tortellini. And I'd say, okay, we'll be right down. I'd take a plate. I'd run downstairs, 4 flights of stairs. He'd say, pink, I hate pink. I'd run back upstairs and get another tray that wasn't pink, and then I'd run back down 4 flights of stairs, and he'd say, here it is. And this ravioli right here, I want it shot like that. So then I'd run up the stairs with the ravioli, knowing that if it didn't get shot within 3 minutes, it was going to look kind of like mush. Trying to remember which was the star ravioli, and yelling all the way, I'm coming up with ravioli, we got 3 minutes. That was my day for 10 days, actually. My legs were like, elephantitis. But luckily, Beatrice DaCosta was able to do these exquisitely beautiful photos for us. And it really actually is, besides a fantastic book, was a fantastic experience. Bless you. And in total contrast to that, the sort of elegance and restraint of that book was the Grill book, which was another marathon photo shoot, but at least this time it was all on one level. We shipped like $6,000 worth of FedExing of props to Michigan over 4th of July weekend, and one of the boxes of fish got lost in the FedEx warehouse, so a box of fish sat in the FedEx warehouse over the entire 4th of July weekend. And I remember Mario's assistant saying, you can't find it? It's the one with the smell lines coming out of the box. But anyway, we really tried to do this sort of very simple layout, and making the recipes, his recipes are typically short, but these are especially short for him. And we decided that we were going to just make the absolute most of all of the recipe headlines. And I will say that I wouldn't advocate unless you have a copy editor who's actually going to work with you, because his recipe titles are long, and typically the word that we wanted to be big was like the stupidest word, so we really had to rewrite them 100 times, and thank God Judith Sutton was so willing to work with us to make them all sort of sensible. I love the octopus. There's some words that just look fantastic big, and I think that's one of them. And as you notice, we also decided that we didn't want to waste a lot of time with the head notes as an intrusion between the recipe titles and the actual getting right into the recipe. So we decided that we're going to move all the head notes to the back of the recipes and make them sort of footnotes. And I like, especially in this page, the concept of the recipe title being the head note, and then the other bookend being the sort of long footnote to the recipe. Or this page, which is 2 together without photos, or this one, which First of all, Italians would never eat corn like this. But nonetheless, I love the sort of largeness of that type and the sort of quirky coloration of these pages. Then came the Spain book, which was another kind of odd project for Mario because he had a deal with PBS to do a 12-part series with Gwyneth Paltrow, Mark Bittman, and this actress who no one has ever heard of. She's a Spanish actress, and I can't even remember her name, Claudia something. They went to Spain. They came back with a big box of shit, and they said, we're going to make a book, but they had no idea how they wanted to make a book. So the other thing was that not like the Sex and the City book where the show runs for 2 years and then you do a book. Our book came out the day the show aired. So they didn't even make the episodes yet. So we were designing a book that had to go with something that we didn't even know what the something was. So there was a lot of throwing out, rejiggering, trying to make some sense out of this big, huge malopo, as they say in Italian, which is a big, like, unformed mass. We ended up just sort of making 3 or 4 really simple compositions. Luckily, the still photography was by this guy who had been a documentary photographer and really was able to deliver us some exquisitely beautiful still photography. And lots of these sort of weird shots of them meeting people that had no idea who they were, or visiting factories where they made stuff. I expected it like Gwyneth Paltrow putting on lipstick in like a hubcap or like, you know, none of that. It was all very sort of staged, which was unfortunate. But I did convince, they had this idea that they were going to use video stills for the food shots. Now, have you ever seen video stills of food? It's lit like hunger. It all looks like Bhopal, like some sort of, you know, Chernobyl food. It was horrible. So we convinced them to get Quentin Bacon to do these exquisitely beautiful photos. And we decided that we're going to make the type really simple, a little bit ornate, but actually relatively restrained and structured. So you got some pages like this. And actually, the show was kind of so-so received. But the book, as far as the sort of travelogue and sort of introduction to Spanish cooking, is actually sort of fantastic. This is a fantastic recipe for pineapple, a little drizzled with lime on top, with some grated lime zest. It's actually insanely good. And then this book, which no one has seen yet, you're the first in the world, I think. It's like me, Mario, and the publisher saw this, because it just came in last week. And we had this weird problem with this book where the recipes were too short. And that never happens. But they're always like 5 pages too long. And this was a recipes too short problem, which sounds fine, but every recipe had a photo. So if you did photo recipe on a page, you'd have a beautiful photo and then 3/4 of a page of white, because there was nothing else to put there until you started the next recipe. So we convinced them, which sounds easy but was not. I think it's easier in magazines to do this, but in cookbooks, they don't like to do this for some reason. We ganged up all the photos, and then we treated the recipes later. So, which allowed us to get these fantastically beautiful spreads. Again, Quentin Bacon photos. Like these wonderful 12 and 14-page signatures of just beautiful food photos, so that you could sort of peruse this and kind of really get excited about what you wanted to cook, and then sort of make your way towards the relatively simple type pages that followed. Again, sort of, we just felt like a red page, what the hell. You know, and then these wonderful sort of cheese and then meat spreads that kind of like provide these, you know, grids of things, and these went on for like 5 or 6 pages. The desserts were the gelataya at Otto. This was a sort of vague book about Otto, but apparently cookbooks based on restaurants don't sell at all these days, so they took Otto out of the recipe, and it's just a sort of recipes inspired by Otto. So those are the Mario books. First thing I looked at was just the evolution of plain old recipes in the writing of, from the simplest recipes. This was actually the first cookbook done in the United States. Apparently, until this book came out, people used to have to use English cookbooks and then try to figure out what they could substitute that they could find here. This was the first cookbook that actually was based on stuff you could find here. I like the bluntness and the easiness of these recipes. I mean, it assumed that someone taught you the basics of cooking, and this was just a kind of chit-chatty, here's what you do to put the recipe together. You know, I think that what's fascinating to me is that now chefs have chefs have so much more at their disposal to learn how to cook, and yet we treat them like absolute idiots. You know, you can watch cooking shows from 9 till like midnight, and yet we have to teach them how to peel an apple. It just seems inconceivable to me. And of course, I like any recipe that starts with the word take. You know, it just seems like someone's in your kitchen telling you how to cook, which I love the colloquialness of these sort of things. Or even this, where they started to pull out ingredients as a separate element. I love that they give all the ingredients, and then it's beat it all together and bake in a crust. You know, hey, you're on your own. Or these sort of, you know, again, starting to give people beat with a rotary or electric beater. Does it really matter? You beat it, okay? Use whatever beater you need. But this is indicative of that, like the language becomes so much more redundant for me. I'm sure there's people that totally disagree. But anyway, and then the worst offender is the latest one, which is the super elaborate fresh strawberry pie. It even tells you have to refrigerate leftovers. Or like, you know, I mean, it's like, hello, there are some common sense things that I think we should leave to people. But I started looking at cookbooks that treated the whole ball of wax in different ways, like this early Thomas Jefferson's cookbook. And I love the sort of, here's the recipe. It's like, it's just a prose, like someone's in your kitchen telling you what to do. I love the fried fish Jewish fashion. Who knew that just frying fish made it Jewish? But apparently there's like fried fish Jewish fashion. And then this book, which is so casual and colloquial, it doesn't have an author, it's by a lady. And I love that it's all, again, very sort of chit-chatty and homey, and it's like, call me sentimental or whatever. But I really have a soft spot in my heart for this type of very sort of, not florid, but, you know, people read cookbooks, and I like that when you read it, it actually reads in a nice way. And I especially like these, I like that there's no fractions. It's a quart of cream, a half a pint of white wine, half a gill of brandy, 8 macaroons or more if you choose. You know, I like the sort of easygoingness of these things, a teaspoonful, who knew? You know, there's something really heartwarming about those things. Or this very no bones about it, Jewish cookbook. And what's great about this is, besides the language, which actually is very prosaic, I mean, what I love about this is it could be Dickens, for all you know. Like, it's not treated like a cookbook. It's a book with recipes, but it's actually treated like a book. I love that they had to fit so much in that they couldn't even spare a full line space between the recipes. They actually did halves. Because, God forbid we waste any space, we got to cram it all in. Or this early Fannie Farmer cookbook, which has the most exquisite script type, I think, in the beginning, but also really economical. And even here, where they start to pull out recipe ingredients, I love how simple the steps are. I mean, the ingredients are almost bigger than the steps. And I can't imagine chicken mousse is that really easy to make. And yet they fit it all into 5 lines, which is kind of fantastic. Or this settlement cookbook, which has a fabulous feature, which I've never seen ever, which is, here we are on front matter, page 9, and we have the index. Like, what a fabulous idea, putting the index in the front matter instead of the back matter, because now you kind of like go right to the index, you look for your anchovy with cheese and anchovy recipe, and you're like right there. There's something so fantastic about that weird conceit. Again, really simple typography, really judicious use of space, and really cramming a whole bunch of stuff in. I loved, then I pulled out a bunch of Italian books that I had in my collection, and these are even better, because they just, you know, these are very chit-chatty, like some old guy at a bar dictated all of these recipes. And they are really just, you know, a big, long thing of how to make stuff. This is a series of books which is recently done, and I only show it because it's printed on cardboard with a fantastic silkscreen cover, and it's printed on this paper that, I don't know if you can tell, but you only can get in Italy, and it's so beautiful. They have the Friulian dialect, normal Italian, and then English underneath. But again, you see there's no sort of big ingredient stuff. And these are little tiny books that I've gotten. Cibrea was a fantastic restaurant in Florence that sells this little cookbook thing. And I like that even here, what they've done is they've taken that one step further, which is now it's basically a paragraph copy, but they've bolded out some of the ingredients. Or this Sapori della Maremma, again, a little tiny book. Okay, they've started to do what we had done in the NASCAR book, but again, you can see where I'm going with, really simple. This book, again, this is a relatively, they've done something, they're trying now to move a little bit into the ingredients being pulled out. And if you'll just indulge me, I always hear people say, Italy is so amazing because everything they do is just fantastic. They couldn't make an ugly thing if they tried. This is some of the food photos from this book. Now, I often say it's better to not attempt something fabulous, to attempt mediocrity and do it well, or to really go out on a limb. Why the cactus? Like, you cook radicchio and it looks like red slime, but this is like really going out of the way. It's just like fantastic. And notice how many times the Cabernet bottle shows up in every single one of these. It's only Italy, and they couldn't get more than one bottle of wine. This is like got a fake duck in the background. This is my favorite. It's swimming in a lagoon with a swan coming by. And this actually is a raw side of beef next to the beef cutlets or something, with penguins in the background and the same Cabernet. Or this, what is that red thing? Or this in some sort of plant. This looks like the beginning of A Single Man with that guy lying in the frozen field. It's just like, it's just so insane. This is, of course, the quintessential Italian book, which actually is still The Joy of Cooking of Italy, Talismano della Felicità, The Talisman of Happiness, which is the best title in the whole entire world. But I love that these recipes are, again, they call out the ingredients, but what I find myself doing when I cook from this book, I read the whole recipe. I don't start step 1 on the counter and then hope that by the time I get to step 2 I haven't really screwed up. I read this like 5 times, and I really think that there's something about the fact that it makes me read the whole thing that is sort of laudable. That takes us to our happiness book, which is The Joy of Cooking. And having seen what came before, I think that you see where they came from. It's basically one long paragraph. It never really occurred to me, even though I've used this book for years. It's one big long paragraph with some judicious indents, and it's exactly sort of what we have seen in the earlier books, just ratcheted up a notch. It does have a few drawbacks, as any serious chef knows. Like, if you need to use flour here, here, and here, it never tells you 3 cups of flour. It says a cup and a half a cup. So you have to do the math of actually how much total flour you need, which is a bit of a problem. But even in their later design editions, this one that used that fantastic illustrations, they still maintain that very distinctive style. And, I sort of feel like it's not hard to cook from this book, so there are more than one convention, I guess, is the point I'm trying to make. Then I looked at books that just had strange or layout things that I hadn't really seen a lot. And there were these 2 French books. There's something so fantastic about this large center column with the 2 weird columns on the outside. I like that the center stuff is meant to be read the same way that we've been used to reading, but then they use these side columns for either equipment or ingredients or sort of whatever else you need, as you can see here. Okay, the centered stuff may be kind of not the best thing in the world, but the overall page construction, I think, was sort of strange and sort of worth showing. It must be a French thing, because this other Bocu's book has more or less the same thing going on, which is the small columns on the outside. I probably would not have done the tiny little ingredient things on the inside of the page, but nonetheless, I like that sort of largeness and the ridiculously narrow columns on the inside. Or this book, which did something, again, sort of what we tried to do in the first Mario book, where they tried to do something with the issue of the ingredients. So we typically end up putting so much emphasis on the 1 cup or the 4 tablespoons or the whatever, and they did the opposite, where they actually really bolded the actual ingredients and made a little bit less of the actual, measurements, which besides, I think, making it easy to read the actual ingredients, for me, is fascinating because it adds a really nice color to the page. Or these type of things where, bread books have that issue where they sometimes need to deal with the fact that you measure bread ingredients, sometimes by weight, sometimes by measure, and then sometimes you actually have to do the English or metric equivalent. So they have these wonderful sort of chart-y layouts for the ingredients, which I find kind of, besides being super easy to read, I love I like what they do to a page. They really sort of, you don't get much clearer than this in the ingredients. And I love the fact that on the page it really gives a certain structure, and it really makes different types of texture on these pages, which I find sort of fantastic. Or this Adaboni cookbook, which besides loving that strange condensed whatever typeface, they also did a very similar thing where they had to deal with English and American measurements. So they had this great system where they put the ingredients here, English, US on one side and English on the other. The great thing about this is that typically when we do a super justified 2-column layout, the ingredients are always that one thing that's never justified. So I love that the use of the rules really keeps the structure of these pages and really fills out the whole page, and I think really makes the pages hold together in ways that I don't think that they normally would have if it wasn't for this. Here's a close-up of the way that they handled those things. This book, which is not exactly a classic, but nonetheless for some reason I found in my collection, did more or less the same thing, a little less clunky because they don't have rules between each of their things. But again, I think that, for a standard 2-column layout, I'm really impressed with how this holds together as a structured page. Really easy to read. This is sort of exactly what I was trying to do with the Mario Batali book. The whole, the bottom stuff, those things don't have measurements, so that's a little bit hard to read. I probably would have thought about that a little bit differently. But nonetheless, I'm really sort of fascinated by that solution for that perennial problem. Or this French feast book, which is actually out nowadays. Again, sort of wonderful, same thing, and I think these pages hold together in a way that they wouldn't if it wasn't for this construction of these ingredients. This is a sort of beautiful page with that wine stain on it, but they've actually done something else which is wonderful, whereas they've stripped out so much of that extraneous language, like cherry tomatoes, parboiled, skins removed, sliced thin, that extraneous stuff. They really have made it the most basic. It's tomatoes, it's shallots, it's parsley. And then they take that concept of mise en place, which is the way chefs make, like when Mario cooks, he has little tiny bowls. Okay, someone else typically makes that for him. But nonetheless, he goes in the walk-in, there's a tray with everything, and it's all ready. So I like that they treat steps 1 and sometimes step 2 as getting your ingredients ready, and then you start cooking. But I like the sort of super easy goingness of the ingredients, which seems to be my thing these days. This is a classic New York Times cookbook. Again, not a super, nothing we've ever seen before in the world of layouts, but what this does is create this strange problem for me, which, because you're basically running things in and there's no, recipes don't always start at the top of the page, you have this problem where if the procedure ended here and the ingredients ended here, you get these weird gaps between things which personally just drive me bonkers. So I found this great Time Life book with the most beautiful cover, which seemed to have figured out a way that they were just going to do more or less the same thing without the rules, and then for them, they just have the techniques in the middle of the pages at a standard distance between them, and then the ingredients, sometimes they're flush left, sometimes they're flush right, sometimes they overlap almost, like one's way up, but it actually really means that at least the center of the page really holds together as a unit. This book had to, it was a restaurant up in Canada that had a problem where most of the recipes in the book had a gajillion sub-recipes. And they decided that they're going to use a very similar treatment there, but each of these separate steps is called out. They do have that gap problem, but I guess there's no way of avoiding it in this situation. But it's really nice how each of these, whoa, I pushed too far. Each of the different steps is a self-contained unit, but I think that it's 5 recipes that still really hold together as a single page, as you can see here. This Jacques Pepin book is a fantastic book, actually, which had a very strange mission statement, which was they wanted to illustrate every single step with a photo. So there's nothing that they don't do in the book that doesn't have a photo. And what's amazing here is the sort of Swiss typographic restraint to these pages. You know, I find these exquisitely beautiful. Call me crazy. But, you know, I really think that there's something about the regimentation and the repetition of these photos with text that really sort of makes them hold together in a wonderful way. And then I found this book, which sort of did the same thing in a very different way. They decided, this is probably the most radical of anything that I'd seen, they were going to take the ingredients and divide them in the steps that they were called for, which probably is almost impossible to put together a shopping list from. But I really like that you know that your butter is needed in the butter stage, and then your sugar is needed in the sugar stage, and your eggs are needed in the egg stage. It is actually, I've never cooked from this, but I do sort of find it an interesting way of sort of dealing with information. There's a few books that I'm just sort of showing because I love the basic multi-grid concept. I've always found this book exquisitely beautiful, designed by Mary Sarah Quinn at Clarkson Potter. A basic 5-column grid, one, and then the 1 is usually empty, and then it's either 2 or 2. But what's great about this, for me, is that there's no division top to bottom. It's all about dividing the page left to right. But for some reason, in the 200 and whatever pages, there's no sort of dull moments. And I think that there's so many variations on these, on this type of layout that I just find fantastic. And then there's a whole bunch of books, like these Phaidon books, that really rely on the absolute most simple layouts known to humankind. Like these really sort of beautiful, just kind of clunky, but kind of intriguing at the same time, layouts. This book, again, sort of odd, but I'm always drawn to this, and I don't exactly know why. What they do, which bothers me and really fascinates me at the same time, is that they did the opposite, which is typically we take light type and we bold things, but they did the bold with the light, which like you never see. And it's sort of fascinating to see, you know, I always teach my students, you can create emphasis by lightness sometimes in a bold field. And here it is, lightness in a bold field. It's sort of a weird, they totally, you know, did the opposite of what we normally think of. And this I love to show only because it's Jean-Georges' first book. It's Jean-Georges, for Christ's sakes. You would be horrified if you knew that I was showing you this book because it's so hideous. He cooks in Prada loafers, okay? But what's amazing is that the strength of these 2-column grids, no matter what kind of weird faux Bauhaus 1988 layout he was going for, it really does sort of, let's talk about that weird macaroni terrine also about it. But nonetheless, it really sort of holds together in a kind of, you know, pretty fantastic way, even though it's not my 100%. This is an example of the sort of strangeness of a 2-column grid for me when they ask me to do a funny reading thing. Like, I find this path very strange. Like, you know, I sort of feel like 2 columns work best either really 2-columny or actually some sort of division, but I do find that, as you can see, especially with the 4 lines weird at the bottom of the page, a sort of troubling thing. Similarly with this book, which is sort of somehow doesn't really, you don't really know what goes with what. This book is a classic, actually, and you ask 100 chefs that have been around, and they're all like, the Silver Palette Cookbook is an absolute classic. And what I love about this is that we always think of sidebars as that shitty thing that Mario added to screw up my design. Like everything's going along fine, and then they throw in a sidebar. I like the idea of building the sidebar right into the recipe. So in these pages, every single page has something in the sidebar. Either it's a recipe, either it's some illustrations, a little thing about Beaujolais, or like a little ditzy illustration about some lemons, or like whatever. But I like the sort of building that into the whole entire book layout. And then this first Martha Stewart cookbook, she is aging in reverse, right? I mean, like, let's be serious. But this was designed by Roger Black, of all people, who comes from an amazing magazine and newspaper design background, and you can sort of see it. I mean, you don't really see a lot of 4-column grids lately. And what's fascinating is, A, the sort of egalitarian treatment of all of nothing's really huge. The photo styling, okay, we'll forget about. But, you know, it's amazing how much you can cram into a page like that. Or these pages that use sort of not 100%, you know, even columns throughout the page to create, you know, it's a pretty standard layout, but I'm really sort of loving the slight quirkiness of a column like this, and then the 2 columns sort of slightly wider. The next book is actually something that I've always loved, the Giuliano Bugelli Sicilian cookbook. And it must be, I think, the predomination of Catholicism in Italy, because they've taken that French thing with the big column in the middle, but now they've made a cross on every page, using the big 3-column wide ingredients across the you know, major cross motif. Here you can see 2 big crosses. Hello. This book also suffers from something that kind of drives me crazy, and I hate that I'll always pick a typeface for a cookbook and then realize that they don't have lining figures. And that's a thing that, I don't know about you guys, we could arm wrestle. But old style figures with case fractions always seems like a really weird thing for me, and this was one of those books that I'll keep looking at pages. I had to bring that up. This book will probably never end up being something that I refer to all the time. But it was designed by Luke Heyman at Pentagram, who I don't think has done a ton of cookbooks, but he's certainly a master typographer. And again, he sort of did a wonderful flipping of what we normally do, which is the ingredient column is actually the longest column in the book, and then the procedure steps are much shorter. And I think what it does is create these sort of weirdly, you know, energetic and pages of sort of wonderful variety. It's all black type, and yet it's, you know, I think exquisitely beautiful. And, you know, hardly a cookbook project goes by that I don't take out for what I call the absolute paradigms of simplicity. I mean, you know, the Alice Waters books are always so exquisitely beautiful, not only because of these, like, crazy, wonderful illustrations, but these are books that I think you just want to curl up in bed and read about corn. You know, and they're so insanely beautiful that of course I take this out thinking, how can I apply this to Mario Batali? And then I realize there's just no way in hell. And I put it back for the next one. But I think that certain chefs actually manage to do that in their books, like in Jamie Oliver books, a kind of relatively beautiful, restrained page. You know, no super large text. Everything's sort of relatively sort of simply treated. And yet, even when they have to fit 3 recipes on a page, there's something sort of wonderful about those. Or Donna Hay, who I've always sort of loved, who manages somehow to out-simple Real Simple. I mean, this makes Real Simple look like Better Homes and Gardens somehow. They're just so, you know, pared down and beautiful. Or these books, again. The Rogers and Gray, one of these women, it was Rose Gray, right, who just died, unfortunately, but have always done exquisitely beautiful cookbooks. And, I mean, it's a testament to how simple these recipes must be, because they can set the type in 24-point type and actually still fit it on the page. But check out what they did with the ingredients. They also moved their headnotes to the bottom of the things, to the bottom of the recipes. But you don't get much simpler than that. I mean, you know, the recipes are all relatively simple, but it's lemons 3, capers 3 tablespoons, anchovies 6. I mean, for me, it's the paradigm of simplicity, and I wish every recipe book that I worked on could be this actually simple. Or Fergus Henderson, who manages to serve the grossest cuts of meat that you've ever wanted, to serve heart, lung, kidney, haggis, lots of haggis. But I love that he serves the grossest food in the world with probably the most beautifully typographic, styled book. And it's three things. It's bold, Roman, and italic, with maybe a couple point size larger for the heads, but that's about it. And I kind of think this gnarly train wreck of tripe would look so much horribler if the typography wasn't so beautifully crafted. Or this crazy tome by the best chef in the world, apparently. And, it's a crazy assemblage of a day in the life of, his restaurant. But even here, I think it's really the typographic restraint in these recipes. There is a big disclaimer in their back that says you can't make any of this shit from any of these recipes, so basically don't even try. But I love the simplicity of these pages. And then, before I close, there are a few of my pet peeves that I have to share. The cover is actually not my pet peeve. We tried to get Mario to do that, believe it or not, when the one he's leaning on the cheese. But it's the centered typography for ingredients. When I was in college, they always said, do not do centered typography ever. It's, for me, either a wedding invitation or a death notice. And for me, you should avoid both of those situations. So definitely no centered type. For me, I could change my tune in, next week, you'll see all my books have centered typography. But for now, I'm really sort of not loving the centered typography. Or this book, I almost shudder to think, because we love Nancy Silverton more than anyone in the world, and she does churn out the best pizza known to humankind, and she's fantastic. But this book has a double whammy of things, which is the centered typography, the centered ingredients, the pretty, almost too long columns, and then the sort of absolute lack of any kind of typographic color on these pages. Okay, my shitty scan doesn't really do it justice, but nonetheless, not really something that is really floating my boat all that well. And then I really hate to bring up The Silver Spoon by Italo Lupi, which is such an amazing book that I think every single designer and chef bought when it came out. But what were they thinking in so many cases? I mean, first of all, Pomfret and John Dory, they had this constraint, this conceit where that column was going to hold any ingredient. So cod is 300 point, and langoustines is 24 point. So you get these crazy large things for no apparent reason. And I've never been a big fan in any type of publishing of a total mirror grid, but especially in this case where the ingredients on the right are flush left and the ingredients on the left are flush right, it creates all kinds of hell. And then to make matters worse, they didn't do anything with the, so if an ingredient line runs over, you'll get a line that starts sliced in quarters. So it's impossible to read, and if it's not bad enough there, try to make your way through this. It's absolutely, you couldn't do it if you had a gun to your head. But then the worst, okay, I know we're only on page 592, and there's another 3/4 of the page to go, but you got 3 orphans in a row at the top of 3 columns. I mean, wouldn't you hate yourself if that was something that you just printed 100,000 of? I know it would make me crazy. So what I thought I'd do, actually, having looked at all these books, is look at the Molto book and sort of see, is there some way that we could apply some of the other things that I looked at and liked to a book that I had already done and see sort of what changed. So this is the Mario book. Like I could ever convince him to do his recipes like The Joy of Cooking, that would never happen in a million years. But if he did, I actually think this holds together much better than I ever thought it would. I think that what I like about it is exactly what I like The Joy of Cooking. You read from start to finish, and it's actually really simple to get through. This takes the Ada Boni, that big Italian red book. Again, what I love about this is I like the banding from top to bottom. I like the head note, ingredients, and method. This is a relatively simple recipe, so perhaps if it was really long, it would be a disaster scene. But this one is probably the only one that doesn't work for Hell or High Water, which was that bread book where they tried to unify the ingredients to these steps. It takes a relatively simple recipe somehow and makes it seem like rocket science. So probably the one that actually doesn't work. But the one that I really wanted to do 2,400 million years ago, or whenever I did that book, was tiny clams scrubbed 1 pound. And I think I should have done a better job at the time of actually showing them this and really fighting, because I think we could have won, and I actually think it would have been a much nicer book. But in the end of the day, what I'm really worried about is this where we're going? Like, is technology going to dictate every single choice that we make? And are we going to only get, besides the color choice and the typeface choice, there's not a whole hell of a lot you can do when you're dealing with, an iPhone. It seems like, every single convention that we've become used to has just been thrown out with the dishwater, and we're sort of stuck with this kind of heinously clunky. It'll probably get better. But, personally, I think that it would make me sad, because I think that, for me, call me sentimental and call me old-fashioned, but taking your grandmother's Kindle off the shelf is never going to be like taking her Jewish cookbook off the shelf and reading that brisket-stained recipe that she used in 1924. There's nothing sentimental about cooking from a Kindle.